Thanks everyone for being here. This is a topic I really enjoy talking about. I've spent my whole career at the Forest Service studying how good forest management can benefit birds and bird conservation. And it's kind of a nice story to tell because there's lots of really good things you can do with good forest management to benefit birds. So I thought I'd start just by giving you an outline of what we're going to talk about today so you kind of have an idea of where we're headed. And I thought first, some of you may be hardcore birders or bird conservationists, but some may be a little less familiar about why we even need to talk about birds. So I thought I'd start with just a little bit of information on why we should be concerned about birds. Next, I'm going to kind of focus in and bring our attention to some groups of birds that maybe need more attention than others. There's a lot of birds that breed in Missouri. There's about 170 different species we can find breeding here. We don't have time to go through 170 species this morning. So I'm going to kind of narrow this down really quickly to a couple of groups of birds, and we're going to look at a couple of examples of those groups to kind of focus our presentation this morning. But we're going to talk mostly about birds that are of substantial conservation concern for a variety of reasons. Next, we'll talk a little bit about oak forests. Since that's the focus of this webinar series, I thought we should say something about what's special about oak forests for birds, because there are some unique attributes of them that make them particularly beneficial to birds. You've probably heard a little bit of this from some of the other presentations earlier in the series, but it doesn't hurt to reiterate some of these things. Then we're going to kind of set up how we're going to address management of forests as it relates to birds. And I'm going to kind of split this into two categories. And you've kind of heard this from some of the other speakers too, but we'll talk about traditional forest management and what you normally think of forests. And that's a closed canopy forest with a mid-story and kind of a leaf litter understory, kind of like this middle picture you see on my slide. But then we're going to contrast that with what I call open forest, or what a lot of people refer to as savannas and woodlands. So these are that bottom picture on the slide. So these are forested sites, but they have fewer trees, more open canopies, a lack of a mid-story, usually due to fire, but then this really rich ground flora. And we really approach the management of these two systems differently. And so that's the way we're going to talk about birds, is management approaches for closed forests versus open forests. So that's exactly what we'll do. First, we'll look at bird responses to traditional forest or closed forest management. And then we'll look at bird response to open forest management of savannas and woodlands. And then I'll just conclude with some of my perspectives on how to think about management considerations for birds, particularly remembering that there's over 100 species out there. How do we think about this in a way that might make sense, or make sense for you as a woodland landowner, and what you can do for birds? So without any further ado, let's get into this. And to begin with, why are we concerned about birds? Well, unfortunately, the answer to this is really pretty simple. And it's that there's a lot less of them out there now than there was 50 years ago. And so there was a recent study that pulled together all different sources of the ways we count birds across North America. And their conclusion is, as of about 2019, we've lost 3 billion birds over what there used to be in North America, or a 29% reduction. So another way to think about that is, back in 1970, there may have been a total of some 10 billion individual birds across North America. Well, right now, there's only 7 billion. So that's where that loss of 3 billion birds comes from. So we're concerned about that because it's almost a third of our avifauna. There's lots of different reasons behind why we've seen those losses. We won't get into that too much, but we will talk about what you can do here in Missouri to help benefit some of those birds that have declined. Now, given that we already mentioned there's a lot of different species out there, over 170 breeding here, we're going to kind of narrow this down to some particular groups of birds. And that's partly because this loss of this 3 billion birds across North America, it's not evenly distributed across all birds. Certain groups of birds have declined much more than others. So let's take a look at that right now. So on this graph, I've broken this into 4 different broad kind of habitat groups of birds. Those that are associated with scrub or successional habitats. So think about this like old fields, prairies with woody invasion, clear cuts, recent timber harvest, successional habitats with a mix of woody vegetation, grasses, and forbs. Of this group of birds, over 40% of the birds in this group are showing these declines, whereas about 15% of the birds in this group are showing increases. So many more are declining than are increasing. And that's out of a total of about 87 species that we put into this group of birds. Now, the only other group of birds that's showing comparable declines to that group are grassland birds. So they similarly show over 40% of the species that were eating grasslands are declining, whereas about 20% are increasing. Now, we're not going to talk much more about grassland birds because our focus is on forests today, but nonetheless, grassland birds are another group of species that are a really significant conservation concern. Now the picture starts to get a little brighter as we move to the right here. This group of forest and woodland birds, so that's kind of these open and closed forest birds. Think of more mature forests here, about equally split between increasing and decreasing species. So not quite as bad as the first 2 groups. And then very interesting, when we get to the far right to the wetland species, we see more species increasing than decreasing. And that's for 2 basic reasons. One is over time, we've seen a shift in weather and climate that has actually benefited many wetland birds, particularly those up in the northern Great Plains and prairie potholes where many of our wetland birds breed. But the other really positive message here is we've seen a really big focus on conservation of wetland birds, particularly waterfowl, through federal agencies and NGOs like Ducks Unlimited. And it has had a real positive effect. So we see more species of this group increasing than decreasing. So for the rest of this morning or this afternoon, I'm going to focus on species in the scrub successional group and this forest woodland group because we're focused on forest birds. And there also happen to be a fair number of declining birds in these groups. Okay, well, let's meet some of these species. So for those of you who are birders, you probably recognize most of these species really quick, but let's just quickly go through here. So these are a group of those birds that fall in that scrub successional group. Remember that 40% of the birds are declining. And if you look through here, you'll see most of these species, in fact, on this slide, all the species have 1 or 2 asterisks next to their name. That means they are, in fact, a bird of conservation concern, either at the region or national level, and it's because of long-term population declines or known threats facing them. So all of these species, there's reasons to be concerned about due to declines and known threats. And I don't need to read through all of these. You can see the names right there. But we'll be talking about some specific examples from this group and how forest management can benefit them. But also notice that this includes both some songbirds as well as the northern bobwhite that, like many of these other songbirds, is across the east facing some pretty steep long-term declines. One other note, the top left species, Bachman sparrow, we're actually concerned that it's actually extirpated from Missouri. I don't think it's been seen in Missouri for maybe 10 years. And it occurs to the south in Arkansas, but maybe no longer in Missouri. Okay, the next group we're going to talk about are these species. And I'm just calling these woodland birds or woodland generalists. And this includes an interesting mix of birds. Some of these are more focused in oak or oak pine and then some in the lower row are either pine obligates or oak pine birds. These are species that inhabit a wide range of woodland conditions, from savannas to open woodlands, but generally not very closed canopy forest. Species like the eastern wood pewee are fairly common across Missouri, yet they're considered a concern because this is actually a different reason. Missouri is such a key part of this bird's range and has such a large part of the population. We want to make sure we're good stewards of it. So this is kind of the idea. We want to make sure we also keep common birds common, don't just address species of concern. The rest of these species with the asterisks is red-headed woodpecker, red-cockaded woodpecker, brown-headed nuthatch are facing declines. And in fact, the red-cockaded woodpecker and brown-headed nuthatch were both extirpated from Missouri. That means they went extinct in Missouri earlier in the 1900s. But just recently, in the last 3 years, we've recently reintroduced a small population of brown-headed nuthatches down in the Missouri Ozarks. Okay, the last group we're going to talk about are these species. Now, these are your classic closed canopy mature forest species. And they include some very common species like the Acadian flycatcher and ovenbird. If you go to any large tract of mature oak forest in Missouri, you're almost certainly going to hear these species. Other species like black and white warbler can be very common too. The worm-eating warbler and wood thrush are species of concern. The wood thrush because it has seen large declines in its abundance over the last 50 years. The worm-eating warbler has seen declines, but it's again like the eastern wood pewee. Missouri is such an important part of this species range, and such a large part of the global population is here. We need to be sure we're a good steward of that bird. Okay, so those are kind of those groups of birds we're going to talk about. Again, we can't even talk about all 18 or 20 of these species, so I'll be picking a couple examples to give you some specifics in terms of forest management. The last two birds I do want to mention, though, are nightjars. These are very different birds. Some of you may be familiar with them, or you may not be. Chuckwill's widow and eastern whippoorwill. Many of you have heard these birds at night calling on a moonlit night in the summer. They're nocturnal. They forage at night, chasing after insects. They perch on the ground or low in the canopy to usually chase moths when there's a full moon. But you often hear them calling in May, June, and July. Now, the sad thing is, those of you here in central Missouri and north, we used to hear these a lot. But it's gotten to the point due to these declines where we rarely hear them anymore. For those of you in the southern part of the state, they're fairly common still in the Ozark region. But as you move north, they become very uncommon. If any of you are hunters and turkey hunt in the spring, a lot of times you're driving out to turkey hunt before sunrise, you'll often see these birds' red eyes glow along the roadside as you drive out to wherever you're going. But again, these two birds have experienced large declines, but we have reason to believe they positively respond to some kinds of forest management. So there's a positive story, and we'll tell that here in just a few minutes. All right, so that's kind of the cast of characters we're going to talk about. We'll talk about some of the birds in each of these groups. All right, now let's just say a few things. What is it about oak forests that makes them special for birds? Well, I already know you've heard some of this from some of the earlier speakers like Mike Leahy and maybe Brian McGowan. First of all, we know that oaks support a high diversity and a high abundance of caterpillars and other insect larvae. And these are very important foods for our songbirds. Most songbirds during the spring and summer are insectivorous. It's a super rich food source for feeding their young when they're nesting. So this fact is particularly important for nesting birds, that it's a rich source of food during a very important time of year, breeding season. However, what people may not know as well is most of these songbirds we're talking about are also migratory. So sometime between March and May, they're moving from the tropics up through Missouri. And this is also the time when our forests still haven't quite leafed out yet, but are in the process of leafing out. And these birds are trying to time this so they get here right after leaf out when insect populations are peaking, so they have that rich source of caterpillars for nesting. But when they're migrating, they also need food. And one very interesting fact is the timing of flowering of oaks through the late winter and spring coincides with migration. So there's lots of insects like the leafhoppers pictured here that feed on that brand new vegetation, those flowers and catkins and newly emerging leaves. And they're a really important food source for migrating songbirds. Not just the ones that nest here in Missouri, but the ones that keep going north as well. All right. Can't talk about oaks and not talk about acorns, right? And I'm sure you've heard about the value of acorns for birds or for other wildlife, but maybe you don't realize how important they are for birds. So certain species like turkeys, grouse, and bobwhite's will feed heavily on acorns. Some of these have used smaller acorns or acorns that have been partially chewed up by other things like squirrels, but they all heavily utilize acorn, particularly in the winter. But you may not know there's some songbirds too. So things like blue jays not only feed on acorns, they're also important dispersers of acorns. They spread seeds and these result in regenerating oaks as well. And then other birds, like some of the woodpeckers, red-headed woodpeckers and other woodpeckers, will actually cache acorns and save them for the winter. So another reason oaks are good for birds is acorns. Then lastly, it comes to be more of a kind of community perspective in that oaks are a keystone species in Missouri forests, woodlands, and savannas. And by keystone species, I mean it's hard to picture an upland dry forest, a woodland, or savanna that doesn't have oaks as the dominant species in them. And these are really important habitats for birds. And so the fact that oaks are critical to these habitats makes them critical to birds. And there's another particular reason why this can be so, and that is oaks are adapted to disturbance, in particular fire. And many birds, as you'll see soon, require some kind of disturbance to create the habitat structure they need. So the fact that fire or oaks are tolerant to fire makes oak-dominated communities with fire as a disturbance a particularly valuable habitat for many birds. All right. Well, now we're finally going to move on and talk about management of these forests. And to do this, we're going to I want to contrast this idea of closed forest or traditional closed canopy forest to open forests like savannas and woodlands, just a little bit in terms of the way management affects these. And I don't want to get too technical here, and I don't want you to get lost in the details, but I just want to make a simple point. And that is, first, let's focus in the lower left at this green circle. And this represents the typical pattern following disturbance, such as a timber harvest, of succession in an oak forest. So in a closed oak forest, if we go out there and it's clear cut or there's a major wind disturbance, it goes through these predictable stages of succession that begin with regenerating trees in what we'll call a stand initiation stage. Those trees start to grow and close a canopy and self-thin in a stem exclusion stage. It eventually grows into a mature forest and begins to reestablish an understory. And if undisturbed, will move towards an old growth condition with more age classes present and small gap type disturbances within it. So that's kind of the succession within a closed forest. Now, each of those stages we just mentioned can be a particular habitat for a particular group of birds. And we'll review those in just a second. Now let's jump up here to open ecosystem phases. And these systems, at the most open end, are grasslands, and then we can move through savanna and woodland. The primary driver of whether it's a grassland, savanna, or woodland is going to be the frequency and severity of fire. So very frequent and severe fires in open lands is going to maintain a grassland. Lower fire frequency allows some woody vegetation and trees to establish. And the less frequent the fire, and depending on site conditions, it can either be an open savanna or an open or closed woodland. Now, the interesting thing is, if we remove fire from these systems, they might go ahead and continue that development into a closed forest. Or if we find a closed forest on the right site and we return fire to it, we might move it back to an open forest like a savanna or woodland. And I know Mike Leahy talked to you some about natural community management, and that's kind of what's involved here. But we're going to look at each of these systems and some of the stages in it and how they relate to some of these birds we're concerned about. Okay, so to start with, let's talk about closed forest management. Traditional closed canopy forest, how we manage it, and how that relates to birds. So these are kind of those stand successional stages or development stages we talked about in the previous figure. And just think about this as what happens if we clear cut a stand or it's leveled by a wind event like a tornado or derecho. It goes through these stages that involve reestablishment of trees. And in this stage, it's a particularly interesting mix of young trees, grasses and forbs, and even some bare ground, as well as some residual stems. And that's a particular or particularly valuable habitat for some birds. But then as those trees develop, they take over the site, the canopy starts to close. And in this next stage, we start to see this self-thinning, where we get this dense sapling stand, starts developing into a pole stand. We see trees getting larger and we see thinning occurring. So eventually we get to what most of you would think of as a mature forest in a pole or saw timber sized stand. And at this point, there'll start to be some canopy disturbances and some redevelopment of the understory and midstory. And eventually, if we let this go without disturbance, we'll see some small scale disturbances and the emergence of this old growth condition with some very old trees and some young trees regenerating in gaps. So we can kind of relate this succession and this management that creates it now to the abundances of some of these birds. One other point I want to make is we've looked here kind of at a stand level, right? We've stepped through how a stand might change over time. Well, it's also interesting what this means at a landscape scale. So if you think of this of how you might manage your ownership, if you begin by, say, every 10 years creating a few regeneration cuts, whether they're clear cuts or selection cuts, over time, if you do this, for instance, every 10 years, you go out and create some new cuts or regeneration openings, you're going to get this mix or this mosaic of different age stands. And this kind of landscape that consists of patches of different aged forest can be very diverse because now you have a bunch of different kinds of habitats in the landscape created by forest management that benefit different species. And in fact, if you're doing this under the guidance of a forester and practicing regulation, this also will produce a sustained yield of wood products as well. But let's talk about what this means for birds. Okay, so the steps we just went through refer to even age management of closed forest, such as by clear cutting. We also need to mention uneven age management, and that's a technique that's also commonly used in forests and maybe particularly used in some smaller ownerships. So under uneven age management, rather than regenerating or clear cutting larger stands that might be 5, 10, or 20 or more acres, you're regenerating small patches, group openings that may have only consisted of a few trees. So you create these small disturbances within the stand. That results in, within a stand, this mix of age classes and different height trees. But across the landscape, it's kind of this same mix of different age classes. So you don't get that shifting mosaic you do under even age management, but you have a similar diversity of age classes, just at a smaller scale. All right, well, these two different management systems in a closed forest actually end up meaning different things for birds. So now finally, we're going to talk about birds again. Okay, so we're going to walk through some examples, like I said, of some species from those different groups. Now, we're particularly lucky here in Missouri because the Department of Conservation, working with the University of Missouri, as well as other universities, has the Missouri Forest Ecosystem Project, where they've studied how forests and wildlife change under different kinds of forest management in southern Missouri. And so the basic layout of this study is there are these replicated sites. The study began back in 1991 with a bunch of monitoring pre-treatment And then in 1996, some stands were clear cut, some were selectively cut, some were thin, and some had no harvest. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at how that affected birds over time, because we have this very nice data set that shows that. So here's a prairie warbler. Prairie warblers are one of those shrub scrub successional birds. They need disturbance. They like very open habitat with some woody cover, but a lot of herbaceous and grass cover too. And so note here, this bird is basically absent from all these forests with no disturbance. However, once the treatments occurred, within a year after those clear-cut treatments, we have abundant populations of prairie warblers. And that's the stand initiation stage we talked about, where we have this mix of young trees, but also grasses and forbs and even a little bare ground mixed in there. So this bird nests and forages down in that low vegetation. And then very interestingly, so there's a gap here, but if we come back 10 years after that clear-cut event, the birds are gone. And that's because that stand has gone from that stand initiation stage to that stem exclusion stage. The canopy is closed, and so we've lost that rich ground cover and have a very young stand, but a closed canopy stand that's no longer suitable for this bird. The other very interesting point here is if you look at these two other treatments, selection cutting, which are those small group cuts, or thinning, those disturbance events or those types of management do not create big enough patches of young trees and grasses and forbs for this bird. So it basically does not use those kinds of habitats created by those practices. It requires a larger disturbance by even age management. All right, here's another very similar bird. If you hear one of these two species, you often hear the other, yellow-breasted chat. Almost the same pattern here with the clear cutting, right? So within a year after clear cutting, we see abundant chat populations on this red line. However, chats did show a little more positive response to the other treatments of selection cutting and thinning. They tolerate a little bit more woody vegetation, perhaps, and were a little more common. But still, that's pretty uncommon for this bird. So by and large, if you want to create habitat for these disturbance-dependent birds like chats and prairie warbler, it requires a larger disturbance of something like a clear cut, maybe a larger group selection cut. Okay, let's look at some birds from those other groups, though, not just the disturbance-dependent bird. So here it gets a little messier. This is the eastern wood pewee. That was one of those woodland birds. And kind of the short story here is it used all those conditions, everything from the clear cut, selection cut, thinning, and no harvest. But also notice it was pretty abundant before those treatments and remains pretty abundant after. There's something going on long term here, but that's probably unrelated to management. So this bird, basically, if there's some tree cover out there, you probably have the potential to have peewees. And in fact, the red line, which is the clear cuts, are the most open habitats, but there are still some residual trees, so you will still find peewees. But their abundance is lower than the stands that were selectively cut or thinned, in which peewees were the most abundant. So here's one of those woodland birds. And in fact, it benefits from some harvest. And in fact, partial harvest was better than complete harvest like a clear cut, but also remains common in non-harvested forest as well. Okay, moving on. Here is an example of one of those classic mature forest birds. These are birds that don't necessarily need disturbance and generally inhabit closed canopy mature forest. So what do we see here? Basically, after those treatments occurred, it remained relatively abundant in the no harvest, the green line, but also in the partially harvested stand. It was very low and almost disappeared in the clear-cut stands. This bird, while it nests and forages in the understory, it likes some overstory. So the clear cuts provide less of that than these other treatments. However, once that clear cut moves on 10 plus years later and it starts to close again and you get it dominated by trees, most of these mature forest birds start to move in again sometime after 10 years after harvest. Okay, so let's contrast that kind of closed forest management by um, traditional forestry practices like clear cutting or selection cutting with open forest management. In open forest management, typically, particularly if we're starting with a stand that had kind of reverted to a closed forest, we typically start with some kind of tree thinning to remove mid-story trees and reduce the overstory trees. This example happens to be of a pine woodland in southern Missouri that was thinned this past winter. So one important part of management for open forest management is reducing the overstory density and removing the mid-story. However, the other critical part is maintaining disturbance by fire. The fire is required because it prevents the redevelopment of mid-story. It keeps setting the woody vegetation back so it doesn't grow up and recreate a mid-story. And it stimulates the ground cover in the understory. Now, maybe you recall from earlier presenters like Mike Leahy, you need that absence of a mid-story and the semi-open canopy to get enough sunlight to the floor in these open forests to have that rich ground flora of grasses and forbs. And that's what is of particular value of these habitats to many of these birds. So now what we want to do is we want to look at how these habitats affect some of those same birds that we talked about in closed forests. Before I do that, I thought I'd take you just through a couple of slides for those of you less familiar with these open forests and how they interact with fire. So here's a very nice oak woodland. You see the rich ground flora of forbs and grasses. This stand might have been burned the previous dormant season, and this could be kind of late spring, midsummer after a burn. You can see over here some dead woody stems that were killed by the fire, and a very nice response by the ground flora. Here's a stand where a little more time has passed. Maybe this is the end of the first summer, or maybe this is a full year following fire. But now you see a lot more woody sprouting out there. And if you go very long without recurring fire, those woody sprouts are going to continue to develop into trees and a mid-story. And so here we are, even a little farther down the road. This could be anywhere from 3 to 4 or 5 years from the last fire. And if we don't come back in here with fire soon, it's going to become difficult to knock back these woody sprouts. And we're eventually going to redevelop the mid-story and return to a closed forest. So now let's look at what these conditions mean to some of those same birds. Now, under traditional closed forest management, it was all about how big the regeneration cut was and how many years since that cut it was and what that meant for birds. For birds in open forests, it's more about, well, how open is the canopy and how often has fire been used? So that's what we're going to look at. So here's one of those same birds, our friend the prairie warbler. Now, in this kind of graph here, we're going to look at one of those factors I just mentioned about, in this case, canopy cover, and we're plotting the abundance of prairie warblers at different levels of canopy cover. Now, I've kind of used the shading here to give you some concept of what we mean by savanna, woodland, and forest, too. So, in general, we often think of as forest as 90 to 100% canopy cover. Woodlands is between 30 and 90%, and savannas as less than 30% canopy cover. Well, if you recall, I told you prairie warblers, they like open conditions. They like that low herbaceous grass and woody cover, a mix of that, and that requires sunlight. So here we see prairie warblers are in fact more abundant the more open the canopy is. In fact, probably you want it to be at least 50% or more open to get enough light to create the right vegetative conditions to have abundant numbers of prairie warblers. And as you also saw in the undisturbed forest enclosed forest, when I showed you those MOFIP graphs, you typically have no prairie warblers or very few. But what about fire? So here's another way to look at this. In this case, we looked at how much of the surrounding area had a fire in recent years. And so this is expressed as with 0 or 100%, 0 to 100%, the surrounding radius around this location was burned. And we see that prairie warblers are most abundant where there's the most burning. And that's because periodic burning sets back the woody sprouting. And then over 1 or 2 or 3 years, you get that mix of grasses, forbs, and redeveloping woody sprouts. And if you just if you keep up that pattern of repeated fire, somewhere between a 3 to 5 year interval, you'll sustain those conditions indefinitely, and you can sustain abundant numbers of prairie warblers. Okay, now let's look at a different bird, red-headed woodpecker, sorry. So this is a bird that is typically associated with both oak and pine savannas. It requires semi-open forests, hence savanna or woodland, and a lot of snags. And that's generally can be created by thinning, which opens the forest, and then some reoccurrence of fire, which keeps it open and also creates snags. So here again, we see red-headed woodpeckers are much more common where the forest is only 50 or 60% canopy cover. In some areas, they can be even more abundant where it's more open than that. And then we can also look at them in relationship to fire. And here we're looking at them in relationship to the number of times a site has been burned in the last 10 years. And the more it's been burned up to every other year, the more abundant red-headed woodpeckers are. And that's partially because the fire, again, prevents the reestablishment of too much woody vegetation or mid-story. And it also occasionally creates snags, which are good for this bird. So here's a woodland bird, clearly requires semi-open conditions and recurring fire. All right. Not all birds, however, like fire and semi-open conditions. So here's one of those classic closed forest birds, and typically associated with mature forest. And the ovenbird, it nests on the ground in the leaf litter, so that might tell you something about why it might be sensitive here. But basically, it's most abundant in closed canopy forest, very low abundance in open savannas. Highest abundances where the canopy cover is the highest. It also tends to be sensitive to fire. So here again, we're looking at how much of the surrounding area was burned, and its abundance drops off steeply the more the surrounding landscape that was burned. It's not hard to hypothesize why that might be the case. This bird nests in the leaf litter on the ground, often forages on the ground. If we burn off the leaf litter that spring, that substrate's gone for that breeding season. So not all birds benefit from open forest management, but many of those species of concern do. Recall the ovenbird is one of those more common birds. It's really not of great conservation concern. Okay, just want to mention one more thing here about songbirds. We've been talking about abundance of birds. We don't only want abundant bird populations, we want birds that are nesting successfully and producing young. Well, very interesting. If we look at some of these disturbance-dependent birds, remember the yellow-breasted chat, prairie warbler, and here's the rufous-sided towhee. These birds also have better nest success where we see those same patterns of open canopy and fire. So in areas that were thinned, we see nesting success is twice as high, 40% versus less than 20%. And again, as the number of burns increases, we see nesting success more than triple. Why might that be? Well, if you think a little carefully about it, these birds are nesting and foraging down in that substrate of grasses, forbs, and low woody vegetation. The more of that vegetation that there is, the more cover for nests, the more foraging substrate. And these conditions create those substrates. So it's not just about bird abundance, it's about successful nesting too. Okay, I want to say a couple things about nightjars, and then we'll try to summarize some of this stuff. So recall nightjars, we had reason to believe from research done elsewhere in the East that they might respond positively to some kinds of forest management. Well, what I'm showing you here is based on surveys we've done throughout the Missouri Ozarks. On the bottom axis here is hardwood basal area. And on the vertical axis, this is abundance of Chuckwill's widow. This is abundance of eastern whippoorwills. Notice that Chuckwill's widow are most abundant where we have these low hardwood basal areas, and also the same for eastern whippoorwills. These low hardwood basal areas are the results of thinning and burning to restore woodlands. So these two birds are responding to the more open conditions created by woodlands. And it's not hard to hypothesize why that might be. If you remember, I told you these birds perch and sally after nocturnal insects like moths, typically either at twilight or when there's a full moon. Well, these open forests, they have better visibility, and it makes it easier for these birds to chase after those insect prey. However, we also see some positive response to fire. A little different between the two species. For Chuckwill's widow, we see some kind of moderate levels of fire in the surrounding landscape. This is the percent area burned in 500 meters. So somewhere around 20-30% for Chuckwill's widow, but increasing amounts up to 100% for whippoorwills. Well, why might fire benefit these two birds? Well, first of all, fire prevents that mid-story from developing, so it keeps the stands open. We already talked about why more open stands might be better. But the other really interesting thing is periodic low-intensity fires stimulate ground cover. And that ground cover and that new vegetation attracts pollinators. And some of the prey that these birds depend on are nocturnal moths and other insects like beetles. And many of those insects benefit from the new vegetation that's created by periodic burning. So we think there's this link between fire and food source for these birds. These two birds are going to be the focus of a big new research project we're doing, funded by the Missouri Department of Conservation, to try to sort some of those things out. Okay, so in summary, I just want to say about the nightjars first. We've kind of learned that basically they seem to like these open forest conditions that consist of some overhead mature tree cover, but an open understory and midstory, and a low to moderate overstory density. So those kind of intermediate canopy covers. They also like to see some openings in the landscape because they'll also forage and sometimes display either out in those openings or on the edges of them. Fire seems to benefit these birds, partly because it prevents the succession or densification of open forest back to closed forest, and also because it probably stimulates the ground cover, which can relate to insect prey. So basically, we think that open woodlands with basal areas of around 9 to 10 meters square per hectare, maintained by thinning and periodic fire, and this is classic woodland management, at least in the Ozarks, really benefits these two birds. We'll talk a little bit about how closed forest management can benefit them too here at the end. Okay, so we've kind of talked about these different guilds of birds: disturbance-dependent birds, woodland birds, closed canopy mature forest birds, and nightjars. Now let's just kind of relate them in a general way to those different types of forest management, just in a relative sense. And I've done that very qualitatively here with 1 to 3 plus signs ranging from okay to really good habitat. And let's start with those disturbance-dependent birds. And remember, we said that even age management by clear cutting, those young stands in the stand initiation stage are used by these birds. The only downside is they don't last very long. By 10 years, succession has moved them on and they're no longer suitable habitat. Uneven age management by selection cutting generally didn't create large enough openings for these birds, so it wasn't particularly valuable. Some of these birds can use the smaller openings, but many cannot. So that's why we get only 1+ mark. But recall that we showed that if you can maintain open forest conditions with an initial thinning and periodic fire, we saw some very high abundance of these birds. And this is probably the historic habitat of these birds. Open forests were once very common through the southeast, and that was probably the native habitat of these birds. Okay, those woodland birds. We talked about eastern peewees. We also talked about red-hooded woodpeckers, mentioned some of the other species. We saw that these birds, both under even age management and uneven age management, they remain fairly abundant through all those treatments and even all stands of succession. As long as some trees were left, like residuals and clear cuts, they were even still moderately abundant there. However, many of these birds find the most benefit, again, in those open forests that have a moderate canopy cover and use fire to sustain those conditions. And that's, in fact, where we also see some of these birds having the best nesting success. Okay, those closed canopy mature forest birds. Well, we showed that they can do very well, obviously, in closed forests, both under even age management and uneven age management. And even if you use clear cutting to regenerate forests, they might be absent for the first 10 or 12 years, but they very quickly return to those stands. And so you can sustain abundant populations of these birds in closed forests under any of these management systems. Under open forest management, well, some of these birds did not do as well. If you sustain very open canopy conditions and you have frequent reoccurring fire, that did not benefit some of these birds. And that's because they either nest on the ground or in some of that understory that fire keeps out of these stands. And so that's not the best habitat for these birds. Lastly, the nightjars. We saw that we talked mostly about nightjars in the context of open forests, right? We said these woodlands seem to be very good for them, where you have moderate canopy cover sustained by periodic fire. That periodic fire creates the succession of or the redevelopment of a midstory to keep the stand open. But that rich ground floor that it also creates is probably an important food source. Well, we also see these species can be relatively abundant under typical closed forest management, as long as there is some disturbance in the landscape. So in closed forest with some clear cutting and some selective cutting or thinning, it creates enough of these gaps and openings that we'll see nightjars be relatively abundant in those sites too, maybe not quite as abundant as some of those open forests. Okay, to close out, we have talked mostly about conditions at the stand level. I do want to say a couple of things about landscape considerations. And perhaps the most important is, if you are concerned about forest birds, whether they're closed forest or open forest birds, one of the first things you want to try to do is maintain as much forest in the landscape as possible. So as much forest cover in the area under consideration as possible. Now, it doesn't really matter to these birds whether that's closed forest, open forest, young forest, or old forest. The point is, we want it to be mainly forest, and this upper picture kind of demonstrates a heavily managed landscape with everything from recent clear cuts, intermediate age clear cuts, to older clear cuts. The important thing is, why there is diversity of forest age classes here, there are not other landscape or other land uses such as agriculture or developed habitats. And that's important because fragmentation of forested landscapes by human altered or dominated land uses like suburban and urban development and agriculture is generally bad for forest birds. For two reasons. One is that land use conversion removes that land from forest, and it's no longer habitat. But the negative effects of that extend into the remaining forest because those human altered habitats typically create high abundances of predators, everything from raccoons to possums to skunks, even blue jays and snakes along the edges that tend to depredate nests of many of these birds in the remaining forest. And that's this idea of forest fragmentation, which is generally bad for forest birds. So that's the thinking here at the landscape scale. Now back to management considerations within the forest. If your primary objective is conservation of these disturbance-dependent birds, like the chat and the prairie warbler, and you have suitable sites managing for open forests, that is, savannas and woodlands with fire and thinning, is the best approach to maintain high abundances of these birds across the landscape. The heterogeneity in grasses, forbs, and woody cover created by fire seems to uniquely benefit these disturbance-dependent and woodland birds. In fact, many of these birds don't care about what trees are in the overstory. It's all about the ground cover and that enough light gets there to maintain it. It's that lower stocking of trees and the absence of a midstory that we talked about that benefits nightjars, and they also seem to benefit from at least some fire in the landscape as well. All right, but what about closed forests? So if you happen to have land that is dominated by closed canopy forest, or if wood production or timber products are a particularly important objective to you, well, you're probably more interested in managing that as closed forest by even age management or uneven age management than managing it as open forest by fire and thinning. The good news is you can still sustain abundant populations of many of these birds, even under those management systems in closed forest. So, as we pointed out, even age management has greater benefit than uneven age management for disturbance-dependent birds because it creates larger openings. Closed canopy forest mature birds can do well, however, under either even age or uneven age management, i.e. management by clear cutting or selection cutting. Even age management with some retention of trees in those clear cuts or uneven age management will also still benefit many of those woodland birds we talked about. And even some of those open forest birds, like nightjars, will utilize mature forests as long as there's some openings created by even age and uneven age management. And some of those disturbance-dependent birds will also use those openings. Okay, well, that's the end of my presentation.